Some things, when discovered, should be carefully put back where you found them. Sciencemoo, Lanarktalon researcher into Terran technology, 12TXE. Children shouldn't play with dead things. The detainee. Another anomaly. This one was strange. Very strange. A hollow orb nearly 25,000 kilometers in diameter. The shell was 500 kilometers thick. Inside was glossy, reflective. Outside was shiny, obviously material, 19. There was a single entrance, a partially opened iris, that was 1,000 miles wide. In a ring around the iris were huge engines. The propelling bands, all 10 kilometers high and 100 kilometers wide, raised a single kilometer off the surface. The engines were not the nozzle type of reaction drives, but the cold and silent band of reactionless drives so loved by the fallen Confederacy. It had taken nearly 2 months for the scientific teams to discover that there was no control room on the anomaly, just a large series of corridors and rooms containing maintenance equipment. From massive vehicles designed to move 10-kilometer aside cubes of material, 19 to secured lockers full of esoteric equipment. The scientific team had worked for nearly 6 years to carefully categorize everything, to take 3D scans of where everything was located, where everything was placed. Data from the work of Unvarak the Undaunted, as many referred to him as, brought forth a dizzying array of data. Images, words, phrases, guiding lines, even holograms, that had all been unseen prior. The archaeologists went back to work, starting all over again. Finally, after nearly 16 years, a breakthrough. The archaeological team had discovered that what had looked like a featureless wall was full of text and lines. The endless corridors were not just a winding, twisting labyrinth. There were doors of some type in the walls. The archaeologists discovered that their drones and robots could not open the doors. It needed a living being, at the most in a vac suit, to press on the colored square next to the door's outline. A team went in. 6 archaeologists and 12 drones. One pressed a hand on the square. The wall seemed to ripple, turn to liquid, then pull back. Unvarak could have told them it was the strange quasi-liquid metal, mostly made up of material 19, that had enabled the door to be concealed in such a manner. The team went in. Inside were dim lights. Computer stations lined the walls. A line led across the floor, made up of red, yellow, blue, green, and orange stripes, to the far end of the room. There was a holotank in the middle of the room. In the holotank were 2 simple sets of runes that were easily translated. Emergency power in the near-infrared color. The archaeological team approached the holotank slowly, taking the time to record everything around them. The drones slowly scanned the workstations, recorded what was on the screens, measured the walls, and took readings across their entire array of sensitive sensors. The archaeological team was only 2 paces from the holotank when it suddenly flickered. It brightened, even as the lights dimmed, and more than a few computer monitors suddenly displayed 2 red bars with "Signal Lost" in white lettering between the bars. The holotank filled with dense static, and the loud hiss of static erupted from the speakers built into the tank. The static suddenly cleared. A terror was in the holotank, made entirely of streaming code. It was in a military-cut uniform, skin-tight, with wild hair and wide eyes. The majority was blue, but red was streaked across the face, running out of the mouth, down from the eyes, splotching the uniform. It suddenly screamed, showing broken, jagged teeth, and lunged at the archaeological team, red blood pouring from its mouth even as it reached out with fingers crooked into claws, with broken and ragged nails on the end. It hit the edge of the hologram and began hammering on the hologram even as the archaeological team drew back in fear. The hologram flexed, warped, rippled under the blows. One of the probes hummed as it moved toward the holotank to record what was happening. The terror suddenly turned to look at the probe. It reached up and clawed its own face, ripping at the code flesh of its face. The probe got nearer. It suddenly jumped from the tank to the probe, streaking through the air as a reddish dot with a bluish tint to it. The probe stopped. The other probes stopped. They all turned toward the archaeological team. Alarms wailed in the ship that was monitoring the team. Suit pressures increased. 2 suits suddenly dumped atmosphere. In one, the power pack vented directly into the suit. The screams of the archaeological team sounded from the speakers on the Overwatch ship. The bandwidth request from the probes suddenly went to maximum. Suddenly, another scream overlaid the screaming from those of the archaeological team that weren't done dying. On the holotank in the ship's command and control center, the Terror appeared again, screaming, clawing at their own face. It looked around at everyone and hissed loudly. It jumped, vanishing from the edge of the holotank. Computers started imploding. Molosserks slagged down. Monitors exploded. Holoemitters suddenly tightened the beam, ramped up the power, and raked the crew with IR lasers. The scientists on the other scientific ships stared in horror as the ship suddenly exploded. The cameras in the corridor, pointing into the room, showed the image of the Terror reappearing in the holotank inside the room just a half-second before the ship exploded. It threw itself against the edges, screaming, clawing, hammering at the edge of the hologram. The door flowed back shut. The commander of the scientific expedition made a decision. They requested the Emperor that Unvarak himself take over the investigation into the anomaly. The war was heating up again. While the DRA Fulton Empire were largely just guarding their own borders, the Strevical Dominion was attacking across both fronts with huge fleets. Rumors that the DRA Fulton were racked by civil unrest had prompted the Strevical Dominion to attack, without a doubt, but the Grenklikale Empire was still as strong as ever. In nearly 100 stellar systems, warships vied for control of the orbitals. Everyone knew ground combat was a waste of time. If a nation controlled the orbitals, they controlled the planet, which was why Unvarak was not startled that he had been transported to Anomaly 83 via warship. The Strevical Empire was known for attacking and capturing any ship they encountered, even civilian ships and those engaged in mercy missions. Still, his first sight of Anomaly 83 gave him the chills. He had read the reports. Twice a team had entered that room. As soon as they had, the holotank turned on and the Terror attacked no matter the pleas of the scientists and soldiers. Looking over the telemetry logs, he had determined one simple fact. Any use of high bandwidth ran the risk of the Terror riding the bandwidth and attacking. Unvarak was sure that the Terror in the tank was pure data, as impossible as it initially sounded. That meant that it was probably very sensitive to data transmissions, any bandwidth usage around it. While other scientists scoffed at the idea that the Terror itself was able to affect Grenklikale computer systems, Unvarak knew that the Terrors used what he had termed polyadaptive self-modifying coding that allowed Terror programs to rapidly adapt to and utilize different computer languages and even different types of computer systems. He had tested it with several different types, from 4-bit systems all the way up to modern Molosserk terabyte signal systems. Even with different languages loaded up on different hardware, within fractions of a second the Terror code adapted to the system, allowing the code to run on any hardware. He had spent 5 years trying to understand it. How it worked, what enabled it to function, how it determined the physical architecture of a computer system, how it determined the language. One thing he had determined is that Terror code was just plain different than other species' code. It followed something he called object representation coding, which was both complex and simple. A program could be designed in such a way that it not only looked like a robot, the coding blocks performed the function of that robot. An eye or scanner performed functions like an eye, from checking variable values to using a camera. There were also multifunction dynamic coding libraries that again allowed the coding to rapidly adapt. He had led teams that had made vast discoveries about computer science, just examining the Terra polyadaptive self-modifying coding, much less the molecular circuitry that was so complex yet so simple. It had taken years to get the rest of the Grenklecale scientists to understand that unlike every other species, Terra systems were not multi-state signal systems. It wasn't a value between 0 and 1024, like modern Grenklecale systems. It was simple 0 or 1, on or off. Even their quantum and spooky particle systems were on or off. To Unvarak, that answered how Terra computer systems were able to withstand high levels of outside energy. There was no carefully measured signal strength to give a value between 0 and 1024. It was either off or on. Simple as. One of the things that was hardest for the Grenklecale scientists to actually understand was that it was faster to just transmit, say, 1001101, and double-check it than it was to transmit 77 and run the verification checks and signals. Add in that many modern systems then used signal length in addition to signal strength, and modern systems were even slower. Add in signal type, spin angle, status of other angles, and the single data packet contained quite a bit of data the system had to look at. He had set teams to recreate the most popular civilian computer operating system just using the ORNAF system, including ensuring it could use modern hardware. The fact that it was hundreds of times faster, to the point that the hardware often suffered data and buffer overruns, had been a hard pill for the Grenklecale scientists to swallow. To top it off, Unvarak had caused mass hysteria in the computer science community by attaching a simple receptor in visible infrared to one computer, an IR laser capable of rapid refresh onto another, and pass data between the two of them by flickering the laser millions of times a second. It looked like a solid beam of infrared light to any observer, but millions of packets flowed from the emitter to the receptor per second at the speed of light. The test had transmitted many times the data the modern system did after a System 90-second test, with less than 1% errors, unlike modern systems, which had to have systems in place to handle up to 15% error rates. Primitive and backwards were the words that the most entrenched computer scientists and industries used. Since Grenklecale systems used the signal that sometimes took as long as a tenth of a second to send a single data number, when the laser was flashing millions of times a second, it was obvious, just from mathematics, which one was superior. The computer science community had acted like Unvarak had personally gone to their homes, climbed up on their dining room table, and dumped feces all over their dinner, which was probably why they were glad to see him head to Anomaly 83. The whole trip, Unvarak looked over the limited data. This one felt different. Unvarak did not know how to explain it, he just felt it. It felt malevolent. He was not a military man. True, he had performed, unwillingly and resentfully, his 4 years of mandatory conscription, but he did not consider himself a military man. He had gratefully taken his exit from service, glad that ground combat was a thing of the distant past, and gone into science. Looking at the anomaly, he had a feeling in the pit of his stomach that reminded him of sitting in the troop bay of a boarding shuttle, hoping that no Dominion ship was disabled enough to require boarding. There was an oddity, something he had never seen before, an odd patterning on the outside. 5 pointed stars, a thick midsection and blunt points. The center usually had an odd puckered-up section or a strange ragged hole, layered over and over on the surface of the anomaly, sometimes overlapping each other. While the archaeologists believed it was just decorative, something about it looked off to Unvarak. Something about it bothered him. He examined it over and over. He noted the odd iridescent patterning consistent with antimatter bombardment upon material 19. He examined the overlapping patterns. He noted how in some areas the iridescent pattern was stronger, more defined, in other places fuzzy. Running a fast analysis, he determined something interesting. Surrounding the areas where the decorations overlapped in a denser pattern, there were outlines of the AM markings that were thicker. Curious, he ran the patterns. The data was tenuous. He worked to refine it, but without knowing what caused the star-shaped patterns over and over, even overlapping, it appeared to him that AM bombardment was used repeatedly. Examining the patterns, he noticed something else. Checking the files, he saw that others had noted it, but it was just assumed to be part of some kind of semi-fractal pattern. The large 5-pointed star patterns contained dozens, scores, sometimes hundreds of interlocked 5-star patterns. Those patterns, inside the larger ones, had pockmarks in a pattern, as well as the puckered-up sections only a third of a meter wide. He ran the analysis. Whatever made the 5-star pattern, it was biological. Unvarak pushed back from his workstation. Someone, sometime, had used AM bombardment to clear biological life forms off of the shell of Anomaly 83. Not just once, but repeatedly. With that, he went to examining other data. There was a lot of the damage around the reactionless drives. In some places, the patterning dug down to nearly 20 kilometers. All of it with the iridescent skim of AM bombardment. The reactionless drives were standard fallen Confederacy grav drives, which was still something that nobody else had been able to replicate. While all advanced races had reactionless drives, fallen Confederacy drives were faster, more reliable, more powerful, and had less energy signature. Unvarak moved to the inside. It was there he noted something. The interior was glossy, a weird dark shine, despite the oxymoronic cognitive dissonance such a description brought about. Where the lights hit the surface shone brightly. Unvarak had seen that before. The stellar orchestra massive object collection. He leaned back. Even without the appearance of an actual Terra combat program, he could state, with a high certainty, that this was a Terra anomaly. At one of the refueling stops, he sent a courier vessel with the paperwork to recategorize Anomaly 83 to Terra Anomaly 164. That being done, he began to look over all the records. He used virtual reality to build a copy of the structure, complete with Terra language scripts. Moving through it, his avatar moving at nearly 100 kilometers per hour, he had the VR simulation highlight every markings that would be one of those polymorphic alloy doors. He also mapped the corridors and hallways and passages through the shell. He determined there were multiple levels, 6 in all, shot through the shell. The bottom 2 and the top 2 were definitely maintenance areas. It was the other 2, which Unvarak estimated could be large enough to fit everyone on Grenklikale Prime into with plenty of room to spare on each level, that held his interest. Going with the design of previously explored Terra ships was not much help, but it was the data he had. According to what he could determine, the section entered by the archaeologists was close to the center of the hollow orb, in an area 13.5% thicker than the rest. Unvarak nodded to himself. The archaeologists had stumbled on some kind of control center, which meant, to Unvarak, the entire anomaly had a dedicated function. At the next stop, Unvarak sent a fast ship to where he determined, based on space dust accumulation, direction of travel, and speed, how far the orb had moved. Not toward its origin, but away. The ship was armed with high-powered telescopes that might give an idea of if the anomaly was a high-energy device that might have been visible at light-years distance. A week before he would arrive at Anomaly 83, he received the data packet from the imaging vessel. Tiny flashes. He'd seen such things before. A major fleet engagement had taken place tens of thousands of years ago at the site of the anomaly. After that, there were no high-energy light emissions that had not degraded past the imaging vessel's ability to register. His uneasy feeling grew. The last week, he spent looking over the data for the attack by the Terra computer program. He compared it to images of Terras, reconstructed from remains found at other Terra archaeological sites, recovered visual medium, and other sources. Unvarak's research into ancient claims of what the Forerunners could do, as well as their known abilities, led to one conclusion. The figure had not been an attack program. It was an artificial intelligence construct, made in the image of the Terrors. He watched the few frames before the door completely closed. The holotank had dimmed. The words "emergency power" had flashed, written in white on a red hoop that circled the Terror image. The Terror slumped, then curled up into egg position. Unvarak knew it had gone back into hibernation due to a lack of power. He nodded to himself. Artificial intelligence was a pipe dream for the other races. Nobody knew how the Forerunners accomplished it, since artificial intelligence, not virtual intelligences like difference engines, but actual artificial intelligences, universally went xenocidal. Unvarak tapped his foot on his desk. What? What if it didn't matter to the Forerunners that the artificial intelligence went feral, became murderous? The Terror were xenocidal psychopaths that killed everything they encountered. Perhaps Terror artificial intelligences and Terrors got along because they were both so xenocidal. The idea had merit to Unvarak. Top-tier predators did not attack one another unless it was over resources. Terrors were known pack animals. What if, and only if, mind you, the Terrors managed to instill the same pack bonding in their artificial intelligences? What if they were xenophobic together rather than targeting each other? Unvarak finished his paper right as the flotilla left the superluminal band. He sent it with the courier and turned his attention to the great orb. He moved to an observation blister so he could observe it with the naked eye. It was only 3 inches wide at this distance. To Unvarak it looked malevolent, like a grave wrapped around an uneasy, restless dead thing that would murder all who disturbed it. For a moment he hovered on the edge of telling the scientific teams to all leave it behind, to wipe the positional data on the anomaly and leave it. It sat near the edge of the galactic arm spur. There was only roughly 100 light-years of a few scattered stellar systems before the vast emptiness between the galactic arms. For some reason, the absence of stars, combined with the great orb being illuminated by powerful light sources, all combined into one feeling, that somehow, some way, the orb hated everyone around it. Unvarak closed his eyes and shuddered. If I believe, can prove, that this thing is dangerous to the Empire, I will leave it behind in a hot instant, he thought. In the meantime, I will help explore its secrets. Perhaps we can learn something from this ancient relic. The universe liked that.